During the High Middle Ages, Christianity reigns as the dominant faith in Europe. Christian society is gripped by a thirst for holy war and righteous conquest. The Crusades, which had originated in the Middle East, had become a continent-wide phenomenon. Armed pilgrims ventured from Spain to Scandinavia to the woe of all heretics and heathens. In the course of the 12th century, even the approaches to northern Europe are gradually Christianized. Only the secluded Baltic tribes are left carrying the mantle of paganism in Europe. There is no shortage of knightly volunteers who are ready to conquer this final frontier in the name of Christ, glory, remission of sins, and the thrill of battle. The expansion in the Baltic is stirred on by the merchants of northern Germany who seek to profit from the lucrative trade routes which lead to the lands of the Kievan Rus. The stage is set for an armed pilgrimage to the boggy wetlands of the Baltic. The ancient Baltic peoples practiced the worship of various pagan deities and idols. They treated nature with love and reverence and believed that mystic entities from the stars, forests, and rivers were walking among them. The majority of the population lived in small towns and villages scattered among vast marshes. The ancient Balts also practiced the building of steep hill forts lined with wooden beams and earthworks. These served not only military functions but acted as the political and social hub to their society. Each hill fort was governed by a chieftain who commanded his own independent territory and retinue. The pagan tribes of the Baltic were not politically unified but were bound by a shared culture and religion. To the east lay the fractured remains of the Kievan Rus. This was a collection of Slavic duchies and principalities that followed the Orthodox sect of Christianity. The mighty Daugava River soon developed into a lucrative trade route between the Baltic inhabitants and the Rus princes. Hoping to share in these profits, Western traders also got involved. Starting around the middle of the 11th century, merchants and explorers from the German port of Lübeck began sailing across the island of Gotland to the entrance of the Daugava. Driven by the wind, they followed the path of Scandinavian Vikings from previous centuries. They bartered with the local Livonian tribesmen who lived along the river. Precious metals were traded for wax, honey, and furs. At first, the Germans sought only business, not to establish colonies or instill the Catholic faith. Only after amicable relations had been established with the Livonians did missionaries also begin to venture into the Baltic. But they found that the Livonians firmly refused to forget and abandon their ancient pantheon. In 1184, a lowly monk named Meinhard made the arduous trek to the entrance of the Daugava with the aim of preaching Christianity. He settled in the village of Ixchile and achieved some success by improving trade links and by healing the sick with European medicine. His accomplice, the Cistercian monk Theodoric, preached in the town of Turaida. There he might even have converted the town's chieftain, Kaupo. Kaupo was a local leader who would play a pivotal role in the following decades. Meinhard also oversaw the construction of new castles in Ixchile and on the island of Holm. These were the first stone fortifications in the Baltic, which served as safe harbors and warehouses for Western merchants. Meinhard's successes were noted by the Archbishop of Bremen, who appointed him as Bishop of Livonia. His private mission was now officially backed by the Metropolitan Archbishopric of Bremen and the Holy See. However, over the next decade, peaceful means of conversion did not yield significant results. Meinhard needed tithes and taxes from the baptized natives in order to sustain his mission. This could only be achieved by means of an armed garrison. Meinhard thus considered the forceful conversion of the Baltic pagans. However, before he could realize his plans, Bishop Meinhard died of illness. The effort at a peaceful mission died with him. In 1198, the second bishop of Livonia, Berthold, continued Meinhard's idea. He led a contingent of Saxon knights in a battle against the Livonians. However, he recklessly charged ahead of his troops and was literally torn apart by the pagans, limb by limb. According to their custom, the Livonians then boiled mead, drank, and celebrated together. Albert von Buxhoevden was elected as the third bishop of Livonia. Despite the difficult task ahead, the young bishop began energetically organizing a renewed expedition against the Livonians. He obtained an official letter of approval from Pope Innocent III. It read, "The Livonian Church is located among barbarous peoples who worship wild animals, green grass, and wicked spirits. There is a danger that the new converts, if abandoned, will return to their former unbelief. Our intention is not to force the pagans to accept the faith, but to protect the new converts from the violence of the ungodly." In effect, the Pope is saying, we will not force the pagans to be Christians. We will just force them to remain Christians after they have converted willingly. This papal bull signaled the official start of the Livonian Crusades, which would last for nearly a century. Albert spent a year recruiting pilgrims across Saxony, Westphalia, and the island of Gotland. In 1200, he set out with 23 ships and a host of crusaders. In a matter of weeks, Albert occupied the downstream lands of the Daugava. The Livonian elders, including Chief Kaupo, were forced to willingly convert to Christianity and to surrender their children as hostages. Albert then founded the city of Riga, which served as both the seat for his new bishopric and as a prosperous commercial harbor. Settlers from abroad began populating the small town alongside the already present Livonian farmers and fishermen. Today, Albert is venerated as the founder and bishop of Riga. However, a major hindrance to the Crusades' progress soon became apparent. The German knights, which were only temporarily in the service of Bishop Albert, returned to their estates in Germany every year as soon as the campaigning season ended. Albert himself had to constantly recruit new pilgrims in Germany, leaving the remaining crusaders leaderless for months on end. Following his departure, many of the forcibly converted Livonians simply reverted to their old beliefs and refused to honor their obligations to the bishop. The Chronicle of Henry recounts how the Livonians cast off Christianity by bathing in the Daugava River, thus washing away the foreign faith. In view of this concern, the preacher Theodoric, Meinhard's former accomplice, instituted a new chivalry crusading order, the Militia of Christ, Fratres Militia Christi, later known as the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. They would function as a permanent militia regiment, garrisoning key strongholds during the winter months while Bishop Albert was away. The order was based on the same regulations and code as the Templars. Members of the order took lifelong vows of obedience, chastity, poverty, and eternal warfare against the unbelievers. All members were headed by a Grand Master who was himself subservient to the Bishop of Riga. The knightly class, by far the most prominent, was composed of skilled warriors who had already attained knighthood. Each member was provided with a full suit of armor, 3 horses, and accompanying servant. There were, however, very few who volunteered to settle in a cold, hostile land, abandoning all prospects of worldly comfort and wealth. Therefore, many of the order's conscripts were supposedly outlaws and adventurers, wishing to make a new life in the most remote corner of Christendom, without laws or king. The order did not exceed even 10 knightly members during its early years, though their skills and armament compensated for their small numbers. In the summer of 1203, Theodoric set out on a long voyage to meet Pope Innocent III to obtain approval for establishing the order. He invited the baptized Livonian chieftain Calpo to accompany him and see the Christian world with his own eyes. Together, they sailed across the Baltic Sea and traveled through Germany, finally reaching the eternal city of Rome. There, they were graciously received by Innocent III within its magnificent cathedral, which doubtlessly left the lowly chieftain Calpo awestruck. The Pope enthusiastically supported the Order of the Sword Brethren, officially sanctioning its creation in 1204. Remarkably, Calpo was also granted a private audience with the Pope. Innocent III inquired about the Livonian way of life and even offered 100 gold coins to him. The Pope's generous present, persuaded Calpo that remaining Christian was only to his profit. Henceforth, Calpo never swayed from his new faith and became a trusted German vassal. Early in 1205, the newly formed small band of sword brethren, led by one of Bishop Albert's vassals, Conrad von Meyendorff, were defending Riga. Suddenly, a horde of Lithuanian riders passed the settlement, collecting tribute from its frightened citizens. The Lithuanians frequently raided their neighbors. They were known as the Lords of the Plain, feared by pagans and Christians alike. The pagan band's leader, Svelgatis, mocked the Germans, boasting, "They shake at the mere mention of our name. Once we've conquered the Estonians, we'll return and wipe out their little village." The sword brethren were forced to swallow the insult and let the Lithuanians pass unmolested. The pagans passed the town and proceeded to pillage the ripe country of Estonia. A couple of days later, a chieftain of the Semigallians, Šterns, visited Riga. Šterns was an enemy of Svelgatis and urged the sword brethren to help him ambush the returning Lithuanians. Despite reservations about fighting alongside other pagans, Conrad von Meyendorff recognized the Lithuanians as the greater threat and agreed to Šterns' proposal. Together, they awaited Svelgatis at the town of Rupaži, having learned of his return route. The Germans and Semigallians occupied a slight hill overlooking a snowy road. Below them, the Lithuanian column was moving at a leisurely pace, dragging along captured hostages they took in Estonia. However, their vanguard noticed the enemy and quickly formed a wedge to cover their baggage. The Lithuanians numbered some 2,000 men. The Semigallians, seeing their large numbers, hesitated and stood still. Conrad von Meyendorff, however, rallied his small band of brethren and fearlessly charged at the horde of Lithuanians. The brightness of their polished armor dazzled the enemy and panic gripped their ranks. They stood helpless against the impregnable knights, who easily cut them down from atop their towering war horses. The Lithuanians were scattered along the road, and Šterns, witnessing their flight, spurred his men to attack the confused enemy. No one was spared, not even the defenseless Estonian captives. 1,200 Lithuanians were killed. Svelgatis, who had dismissed the Germans as cowards, was himself slain, sealing the Sword Brethren's first stunning victory. The Germans shared the spoils of the battle with their new ally, Šterns, and urged him to convert to Christianity. For now, though, Šterns still refused to be baptized. By now, Kaupo had returned from Rome. However, back home he was met with suspicion by the Livonians because he had taken up the Christian faith. He was exiled from Turāida by his own people. Kaupo called upon the Order of the Sword Brethren to help reclaim his former domain. The Sword Brethren, in turn, invited their new friend, Šterns. Together, they torched Kaupo's former hill fort. Many of Turāida's residents were once friends and relatives of Kaupo, but they were nevertheless ruthlessly punished for opposing the word of Christ. Today, Kaupo has become a symbol of a traitor who sold his soul to the foreign bishops. Regardless, Kaupo did earn the trust of the German crusaders and received back Turāida as a fief. After this, most Livonian communities conformed to Christian rule. Preachers were sent out to deliver the sacramental baptism across many villages. Once baptized, a subject had to perform the duties of a neophyte or a new Christian. This included paying an annual tithe of crops, mostly rye or barley. Additionally, the neophytes were mandated to participate in the campaigns against any of their neighbors who refused to accept Christianity. These new duties were quite a heavy burden for most of the peasant population. They quickly grew to resent their new masters. Nevertheless, the Germans relied on the baptized natives to fill the ranks of the army. As a result, the forcefully enlisted natives who did not wish to die for a foreign religion often deserted at the first opportunity. As soon as the Church of Livonia achieved its first territorial gains, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword began demanding a share of the conquests. Bishop Albert was highly displeased with the rising insubordination of his knightly warriors. However, on the request of Pope Innocent III, the Sword Brethren were granted fiefs in the newly won land, amounting to 1/3 of the conquests. With their own land domain, the Sword Brethren gained significant autonomy and power. The unruly band of outlaw crusaders would continue to defy their nominal liege, Bishop Albert. They soon built their own castle of Venden. Nevertheless, Bishop Albert resumed his campaigns along the Daugava, hoping to monopolize trade along the river. By 1209, Albert had subjugated the wealthy hill fort of Jērsika, thus clearing the path to the lands of the Kievan Rus. In 1212, the Rus Prince of Polotsk signed a treaty with the bishopric of Riga, allowing German traders free passage along the river. This secured a valuable source of trade income for the crusade. Meanwhile, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were pursuing their own independent ventures. The order quickly noticed the persistent feuding between the tribes of Latgalians and Estonians, who had an ancient feud. They realized a promising opportunity. In 1208, the Sword Brethren made an alliance with several Latgalian leaders regarding a joint war against the Estonians. The Sword Brethren set the hill fort of Otepää aflame, marking the first advance into Estonia. The following years saw innumerable skirmishes and raids conducted by the Sword Brethren from their stronghold of Venden. The fighting left entire villages smoldering and desolate. However, tragedy struck the Order's Grandmaster Venno. A disgruntled knight of the Order, Wigbert, had been removed from his office as garrison commander of the castle of Venden. His humbled pride led him to murder Venno inside the Order's own convent building. He was, however, quickly punished with a painful death on the torture wheel. This instance further smeared the reputation of the small band of Sword Brethren. The vacant position of Grandmaster was filled by Fulkvin von Nauenburg, a man with a straightforward manner and a loyalty to his given word. Like his predecessor, however, Fulkvin continued to follow a separate path from the Bishop of Riga. Fulkvin concentrated the Order's efforts toward Estonia. By 1211, the important Estonian hill fort of Viljandi surrendered to Fulkvin under the condition of baptism. An Estonian elder named Lembitu quickly assumed a central role as the leader of the Estonian resistance. Fulkvin advanced on Lembitu's hill fort and took him captive. He was forced to convert to Christianity and to surrender his children as hostages. After this, the Germans let him go free, not expecting any more resistance from him. However, in spite of the risk to his own children, Lembitu continued to plot against the Crusaders. By 1217, the Crusaders began building a castle on top of the hill fort of Otepää. The Rus Prince of Pskov, Vladimir, considered this to be a violation of its sphere of influence. He recruited a large army and besieged Otepää. 2 weeks later, Fulkvin and the Sword Brethren surrendered the castle in return for their lives. This was the most serious setback the Crusaders had yet suffered. Lembitu recognized this as a promising moment to drive off the Christians. Warriors from each Estonian county were summoned to Lembitu's hill fort of Leole. They gathered there 6,000 men strong. Lembitu also requested aid from Prince Vladimir, but after 2 weeks of waiting, the Rus army failed to materialize. Grandmaster Fulkvin was informed of the impending threat. In order to prevent the Estonians from uniting with Prince Vladimir, Fulkvin raced north with 3,000 men. Upon reaching Viljandi, he learned that Lembitu was approaching his position. Fulkvin organized his army into 3 columns. The baptized Latgalians guarded the left flank. Several German militias, formed from the citizenry of Riga, stood in the center. They were led by the abbot Bernhard von Lippe. The Livonians, led by their chieftain Kaupo, occupied the right flank. The Sword Brethren formed the vanguard, alongside another knightly regiment under the command of Count Albert von Lauenburg. The battle commenced on the 21st of September, St. Matthew's Day. The Estonians emerged from the woods and rose to the attack. The attack was so swift that the Germans couldn't fire a single volley from their crossbows. Nevertheless, the sword brethren galloped at the Estonians and rapidly tore into their center, breaking the first lines upon impact. Simultaneously, Limbitu attacked the Latgalians on the left, but they defended themselves stubbornly. The Livonians, however, were quickly driven back. They saw hundreds of spears flying menacingly overhead. Many Livonians were not eager to fight in the first place and simply deserted the field. Amid the fighting, Kaupo had both of his sides pierced open by a spear and was left mortally wounded. The Estonians began threatening the German rear, but it was too late. The sword brethren had already pierced the enemy's center. The Estonians turned to flee in all directions. Chieftain Lembitu was still holding his own until he was caught and beheaded by a Latgalian warrior. The entire Estonian army vanished into the forests, abandoning the field to the Christians. Around 1,000 Estonians were killed in the battle, but many more were later found hiding in the marshes and executed. The Germans suffered some 100 killed. The Livonian chieftain Kaupo was among them. In his dying moments, he confessed the Christian faith one final time and distributed his land and possessions to the Church of Livonia. Kaupo's character and motives remain unclear and divisive. He is often blamed for going over to the foreigners and turning his own people into serfs. However, others credit him with the far-sighted decision to integrate the Baltic into the wider Christian realm. His real thoughts will never be known. But your real thoughts, dear viewer, can be posted in the comment section. Was Kaupo a traitor, a saint, or maybe both at the same time? You may settle this debate once and for all.